Today, we're discussing how to handle pressure from leadership during a workplace investigation. My name is Dorian Prasad. I am the senior lawyer at Prasad Employment Law. We are a team of lawyers who specialize in conducting workplace investigations and helping you to create healthy workplaces through investigations, training, and proactive advice. I want to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar, and a special welcome to those of you who might be joining us for the first time. We trust that you'll enjoy today's session, and we ask that you spread the word and help us to continue to grow this community as we learn and grow together. We reserve quite a bit of time on the back end of these presentations for questions and answers. So I would encourage everyone to please use the chat function and the Q&A function within there to direct your questions to us. My executive assistant, Neha, is with us, and she'll feed those questions to me at the back end, on the back end of the webinar today. If for whatever reason we run out of time and are unable to get to your question, please do send me an email or connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to connect with you one-on-one to unpack whatever issue you might be experiencing. So I'm sure as we have all done this work that there have been occasions where you are conducting a workplace investigation and you have a keen sense that management or other factions within the management group have very strong ideas in terms of how the investigation should unfold and the conclusions that you should reach. They already have, from the beginning of the process, an end goal in mind. Let me tell you about an experience that one of my clients had. Let's call her Jody, and she is the HR director at a school board. And Jody received a complaint of personal harassment and a failure to accommodate from a teacher within the board. And the complaint alleged that the principal at the school was not giving her the same resources as other staff. She was being targeted for differential treatment. She had a medical condition that required certain accommodations, and the principal wasn't complying with those accommodations. It was quite a lengthy complaint from this individual. And one of the issues is that this wasn't the first complaint that this teacher had made. The complainant, was a frequent flyer, so to speak. She had filed several complaints over the years, to the point where even her own union was a little bit exasperated with her. So you can understand then when the latest complaint came in, management had enough, and they were already, thinking about how do we, exit this individual. They weren't really paying attention to the merits or the good faith, whether or not the allegations were actually brought in good faith. And this put Jody in a difficult position as the HR director. She understood that there's a certain process that needs to be followed. And in as much as folks in senior management wanted to, exit this individual from the board, what if some of the allegations were true? What if they were substantiated? That would certainly change the dynamics here. And maybe it was the reality of that. Like, what if some of these things are true? Maybe it was the reality of that caused some apprehension on the part of management. Nevertheless, they had one goal in mind, and that was to, get rid of this thorn in their side. They had simply had enough of this individual. And Jody, sitting there, trying to figure out what to do, you're really faced with a impossible situation where you know what the obligations are to move ahead with the process. At the same time, if you move ahead with it, no matter how it turns out, you know that the people that you report to are going to not look at you kindly. They're going to be upset with you for you essentially dragging them through this process. And if you happen to make a finding in favor of the complainant, well, again, you can imagine how much more difficult that's going to be for a management to digest, and whether right or wrong the feelings that they're going to have towards Jody. So yeah, it's unfair, right, for an individual to be placed in that circumstance. You're there to do a job and to do it with integrity to the best of your ability. And facing this pressure from the outside is tough. And so that is the reality, however, that we all work with and that we face. And no matter what workplace we're in, whether we find ourselves in a school board, or you're working for a municipality, or you find yourself, excuse me, in the private sector, and in every workplace, there are these alliances and groups with certain interests, and those interests may not often be aligned with how do we follow the right legal process or do what's best for the organization. Sometimes those interests are more closely aligned with personal goals. So I understand that pressure that you face, because it's happened to me. I had a situation a while back where a client retained me. They had an employee who was complaining of sexual harassment and personal harassment in the workplace. And then that complaint escalated, where she indicated that, despite having reported these concerns to her immediate supervisors, that her complaint was being ignored. And she added that as an element to her formal complaint. And this finally came to the attention of the director of HR, and he brought me on board to investigate. After clarifying the mandate, and onboarding me, he then left the organization to take another job. So I developed an investigation plan and met with the new HR person that was taking his place, and she seemed lovely. We discussed the plan and the complaint and what the plan was going forward. And I started getting pushback pretty early on, where she started, questioning, why I needed to meet with certain witnesses. One of the individuals I actually had proposed meeting with was this former HR director who had moved on to another role, and because he was intimately involved in the discussions with the parties and helping to kind of piece together what had happened from the beginning of the complaint to the point where it then escalated to allegations of obstructing the complainant having the matter investigated. And the new manager pushed back on that. She's like, well, why do you need that information? And and indicating that she didn't have the contact information for this person, so we should just skip that individual and move on. So I found that odd, because this evidence was clearly relevant to the issues that were in dispute. So that was my first sign that something's not quite right here. And then, as I started interviewing witnesses, I found out that this individual was speaking to the witnesses before I met with them, and then speaking with them after I met with them to determine what questions I had asked, what information had been given. And so this was just very odd and very troubling behavior, which went to the point of undermining the process. I ended up connecting with the former HR manager. I found him on LinkedIn and conducted an interview with him. He then shared with me that the individual who was the responding party in the complaint was being mentored by a senior executive. He was her protege. And the new HR manager, it came up through the ranks, and she's closely aligned with the respondent and the senior executive. So this whole complaint and the facts as they were did not look good for this responding party. And so these individuals had motive or were motivated to sweep this under the rug and make sure that the findings never saw the light of day. And that helped me to then understand what was going on, because it's jarring when you are brought in as an outsider to help an organization solve a problem. Usually you're working cooperatively with the organization. And in this case, we were clearly butting heads, and I had someone on the inside actively working against me. So this behavior on their part continued, but I then understood it. It escalated to the point where there was a laptop that had key information on there. This is a laptop that belonged to the former HR director. And during the course of our interview, he indicated that certain notes and other documents I'd asked for were saved on that laptop. However, when I went to access that information, the new HR manager indicated that she had asked IT to wipe that laptop. So all of that information had been deleted and none of it had been saved. So again, you can question why anyone would wipe a laptop that had historical HR information. You would think that information is important to your role in terms of doing that job of HR and having a history of grievances that were filed and how things have been resolved and just other key documents that were on there, quite apart from the investigation. But certainly, if you're in the middle of an investigation, you would think that there would be red flags or alarm bells going off saying, hey, maybe I shouldn't be deleting the contents of this laptop. We pressed on and made our way through the process, and to deal with the obstruction that I was experiencing, I drafted the report and I submitted it to the corporation's external legal counsel, and also explained the difficulty that we had in terms of working with the client. But here were the findings, and the organization then had the ability to discuss that at a higher level so that the findings were not swept under the rug. And at that point, they could take the steps that they thought necessary in response to my findings. But it was a jarring experience to again be brought in where you're usually working cooperatively with someone, and then at every step to be challenged and to be undermined. So I can sympathize with those of you who are navigating these corporate politics on a daily basis. And it's important to maintain your focus on the work that you're asked to do, because ultimately it's your integrity and it's your reputation that's on the line. So we're going to go through some tips to identify where others might be trying to unduly influence you, and the steps that you can take in response to that. Some of the signs that the corporation's trying to lean on you to think a certain way or to make a certain finding is at a lower level is just disparaging comments made about the complainant, right? So the complainant comes forward, raises certain allegations, and right away there is issues brought up from the past about how this individual might be a difficult employee or not a productive employee, or whatever the case might be. And so you get these disparaging comments to cloud the lens through which you view the complainant and then the allegations that have been brought forward. You might also experience discussions or be party to discussions about what the ideal outcome would look like, right? Like, wouldn't it be ideal if we just didn't have this individual in the workplace anymore and we could just move on without him or her? And there are certain cases where you might actually get a hint that, look, if this investigation doesn't go the way, here is the potential downfall for the corporation, and that and if this goes south in the way that it could, that might have an impact on jobs. So it may not be a direct shot across the bow at your job per se, but it's certainly the specter of the negative press or the large arbitration award or whatever the case might be, the specter of that negative outcome is played up in a way where you know that that person is drawing a link between that negative outcome and potentially your employment being on the line, or the employment of others. So again, adding that external pressure to the work that you are being asked to do, and being asked to do in an impartial way. So, that forces you to ask the question, are you approaching this as an impartial investigator, or are you trying to essentially engineer a result, right? And you can know that when you're going into the task and asking yourself, what, whose interests am I focused on? Are there secrets that I'm aware of, or that I've been told about, that I'm trying to keep, right? If you find yourself, focusing on those questions, then that tells you, your focus isn't on the allegations and the process that is about to unfold, and the steps that you need to take to, get to the heart of what occurred in the case that's before you. So there's, two things that I want to bring to your attention: is the integrity of the investigation, and then your own personal integrity, right? Being in the role that you're in, having to investigate a complaint, you want to be focused on, first of all, the integrity of the investigation. What are the corporate obligations here? You've got a complaint of harassment, sexual harassment, workplace violence, and what does the law say that the corporation or the organization is required to do in those circumstances? What are the interim measures that need to be put in place, if any? Who are the folks that you need to meet with to get to the bottom of the issue? And what is the process then that you're going to follow to see this investigation through to the end, and follow a process that's going to stand up to scrutiny? So if you're not focused on doing that work in a reasonable way, and if you are, maybe looking at not meeting with certain individuals because the organization doesn't want you to, if you're looking at, maybe not fighting to get certain evidence because, it's difficult to get to, but also because, again, folks want to keep certain skeletons in the closet, then, or if you find yourself showing deference, right, to one of the parties because this is a prominent individual and we don't want to bother him or her with having to participate in the investigation, that all of those things compromise the integrity of the investigation, and those things ultimately, when these cases get litigated, these issues are going to fall at your feet. So you want to be focused, first of all, on how do we protect the corporation, right? How do we protect not how do we protect an individual? How do we protect the organization? What do we need to do here to make sure that the organization follows the process that they're mandated to follow? And then, setting up a process that's going to stand up to scrutiny, right? A process that has where you're maintaining that integrity of the investigation. And then secondly, we're looking at your personal integrity, right? When usually in these cases, especially when you're dealing with problematic employees or very serious allegations, they're going to be challenged, right? Like this issue that I mentioned that Jody faced at the school board. That when there's issues with a teacher, that the union is going to grieve it, and even if you have all of your ducks in a row, that situation is likely to end up in grievance arbitration to some degree. It may not end up in a full hearing, but they're going to start the process, and there'll be some settlement discussions that take place, and they may or may not decide to move ahead. But in the course of that, you are going to be asked to marshal this evidence from the investigation. The organization's lawyer is going to come to you to say, okay, here are the allegations that were raised. The union or the opposite party here is challenging that whether or not this investigation was properly conducted or fairly conducted. So, let's go through the allegations and let's go through your investigation plan. Let's look at who you met with and who you didn't meet with and why you didn't meet with them. Let's look at the evidence that you collected and why you didn't maybe collect other evidence that, based on the information available to you, you arguably should have pursued. All of these are questions that the organization's lawyer is going to be asking of you in preparation for that legal proceeding. So ultimately, regardless of the politics at play, you end up being the person that is on the hot seat. It's your integrity that is on the line to a great degree here. So you want to make sure then, as you go through this process, and if you feel that folks are leaning on you to cut corners or to make certain findings, document that. And you want to document that at the time that the conversations are happening, right? So you don't want to wait for a year or a year and a half down the road when the matter is finally getting to the discovery stage and the organization's lawyer is asking you questions. You want to make sure that you're doing this at the time that the conversations are happening, and making note, like I said, of what folks are saying to you, who's saying them. If you're being denied access to certain evidence, you're making a note of the fact that, yes, I did ask for the laptop and I was told the laptop had been destroyed or wiped of its contents. And I don't know why those instructions were given to the information technology department. These are all the things that you want to make note of, so that the organization's lawyer, to the extent that these issues are then being raised, they have a better sense of the case and they'll know, okay, well, corners were cut here, certain things were done that should not have been done. This is the case that I need to settle on behalf of the school board, as opposed to pushing this through to arbitration. So all of these things help you to not just protect the process, but also protect yourself, right? When the tough questions are asked, and those tough questions may not be asked at the time of the investigation, but you can be sure that it may not happen in every case, but you can be sure that given the number of cases that you're dealing with, that a handful of them will end up seeing the light of day, that there will be a brighter light that's shone on these discussions and these decisions that you're making. And you want to put yourself in the most comfortable position that you can when those questions are being asked. Okay, so we see repeatedly in the case law as it relates to workplace investigations that one of the biggest mistakes that organizations make is not having an impartial investigator assigned to a file. So you want to make sure that you're avoiding not just bias, but even the appearance of bias. So if there's any relationship that you have with the parties, or anything that impacts your ability to make a fair and dispassionate assessment of the case, that you raise those issues and the organization can find an appropriate investigator. You don't want the process to be clouded, again, based on based on a personal relationship or whatever the case might be, and that affects the outcome of the investigation, or whether or not folks accept the outcome of that investigation. And the issues that we're dealing with today, where you're dealing with those political alliances and folks leaning on you for a certain outcome, that gets us to the issue of confirmation bias, right? Are you engineering a result? Confirmation bias is where you have an idea of how this case should be decided, and that then impacts the questions that you're asking and how you conduct the interviews. It then impacts the evidence that you collect, or how you interpret that evidence, right? What kind of weight are you giving to the evidence of the parties? So you want to be mindful of that as you go through the process, that you're acting in an impartial and in a neutral way. And to the extent that you find that you do have maybe strong negative feelings about one party or the other, or for whatever reason, you don't feel as if uh, you can conduct the investigation in a fair way, it's better to identify that, at the beginning or even in the middle of the investigation than to go through the process, ignore it, and then at the end of it, having to essentially, redo the investigation. In some of these cases, I've had clients who have asked those questions, right, throughout the process, and sometimes it's not until you're into it a little bit where you realize, oh, you know what, based on this new witness that's come up or a new party that's been added, that creates a different dynamic that wasn't there at the beginning, and maybe I do need to bring in an external investigator. So usually when you have a very serious allegation where there's potential violation of policy or the law, and there's the high risk of litigation or some legal process unfolding and potential legal liability, it makes sense to bring in an external investigator, again, to better protect the integrity of the investigation, because as we know, there are serious outcomes that flow from an investigation and its findings, and there are serious consequences to one's employment or continued employment with the organization. So you want to make sure that the process that's unfolding is free of bias, free of undue influence, and you, at the end of the day, you're left with a report and conclusions that you can rely on to make the appropriate decisions that are necessary going forward. So in conclusion, I understand the pressures that you face in terms of navigating these corporate politics, because I've been there too, and it makes our jobs that much more difficult. You're already dealing with challenging fact patterns and personalities involved in the conflict itself, and then you've got this added pressure to make sure that you've got these other eyes on you, and make sure that you're doing it right, and that no matter what the outcome, that there are going to be folks who are displeased. But you want to be alive and not ignore the corporate politics, but I would encourage you to focus on your process and focus on maintaining the integrity of the investigation and protecting and maintaining your own personal integrity. And I found it helpful to have two reports, right? One report that strictly deals with the investigation, and then this side report that documents any undue influence and other things that have happened along the way that may have impacted the way that the investigation was conducted. So I'll leave you with those tips, and happy to answer any questions that you might have. Please do direct those using the chat or the Q&A function within there, and we'll be happy to take those questions now.
Hi, Dorian. We've got a question. Should the investigator always be third party to remove the bias?
I don't agree that the investigator should always be third party to remove bias. So if bias exists where you have, oftentimes what we see is that where you have a relationship between the parties. So the person investigating the case has worked closely with the either the complainant or the respondent, and that personal relationship then clouds the case. In certain instances, we've seen there was a case involving Magna Corporation where the HR manager was investigating a case, and this complainant had actually brought an allegation against her personally, and so that was a separate file. But then he brought forward a complaint of harassment, and the same individual who he had accused of misconduct was then investigating that concern that he had brought forward, which didn't involve her. But you can appreciate that based on the fact that he had filed a complaint against her before, he didn't feel like he was going to get a fair shake. And so that was a clear case where there's a I would argue, bias, or certainly the appearance of a bias in that case, and that HR manager should have identified that issue and found either somebody else internally or an external person. So, it depends on the size of the organization. You often have other options to conduct an investigation, but you want to go with an external person where you either don't have those resources in house to do it, or where you're dealing with an individual where it's going to be difficult for an internal investigator to hold that person accountable, right? So think about an HR manager being asked to investigate a senior executive or a vice president of sexual harassment. Like, is that HR manager really going to feel comfortable sitting across the table and maybe going through some of the lewd text messages that have been exchanged, and really be able to ask like those rigorous questions to pin the witness down? I doubt it. So that's a circumstance where given the power imbalance between the parties, it would make sense to have an external investigator come in and look at that. If you have a case that doesn't necessarily involve a senior executive, but the fact pattern is very complicated, or you can tell that this is something that's likely to end up at litigation, that's where you want an external person involved to make sure that it's looked at, not just in an impartial way, but that person with their expertise is able to collect the evidence that you need and give you a report that it gives you confidence that, look, here are all the relevant questions that were asked. I know the strengths of this case. I know the weaknesses of the case, and I can then make a decision as to whether or not I want to move ahead with discipline or termination, understanding what the risks are based on what the investigator found. So based on my litigation background, that's how we approach investigations, is knowing what's going to happen at trial or at arbitration. We work backwards from there to ask those questions to give you a robust document that you can then use as the basis for making a decision, or making a decision to understanding that, look, I've got a strong case. So even if this goes to a hearing, I know that we're on solid ground.
Thank you for that. Another question. What if the person in question is a VP and it seems the only resolution the employees are looking for are hoping for change in leadership? The issue is about not going to the department manager first before speaking with their team members.
Okay, so I'm happy to connect one-on-one, Neha, with this individual and to unpack that a little further. Now, I would say that there's a lot of cases, right, where you have employees come forward and the only thing that is going to satisfy them, or often sometimes this comes from the union, the only thing that's going to satisfy them is if this senior person is let go. And you have to look at the facts of the case, and you have to look at what's reasonable in the circumstances. And certainly from a labor relations perspective, it's problematic if you have employees dictating the outcome of the complaint and what should happen. And certainly if you move ahead with that, without relying solely on that strong desire that they have, as opposed to the realities of the case. So you always want to make sure that your labor relations decisions are based on the evidence and based on your assessment of the individuals involved, and you make that determination about what the misconduct was, if any, and to the extent that there was misconduct, is there a rationale here for, you're looking at, should I discipline this person, or is there a rationale for moving forward with the individual? What kind of judgment did they demonstrate in the context of the case? And is this someone that we can trust going forward, right? So there's many facets to what you do with the investigator's findings. You need to unpack all of that to then figure out what the best path is going forward. But certainly you never want to be in a situation, regardless of what happens, where you're just responding to the employee's wishes and letting people go.
Thanks, Dorian. I believe that's it for the questions for now.
Okay. we do have some more time, so I don't know if others are formulating some questions there. Happy to give you some more time to send those questions through to Neha and I. Well, I'm not seeing anything come through, so I do want to thank everyone for attending the webinar this afternoon. I hope it was helpful to you, and want to continue to encourage you as you do this work and take on the challenges that you're faced with. Please do look out for our email in the days ahead with details about next month's webinar, and please do share the invite with others in your networks that we can continue to grow and learn together. So thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, my email address is on the screen there, so please don't hesitate to reach out, and I'd be happy to connect with you for a virtual coffee to unpack whatever issue you might be experiencing. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good afternoon.